J.D. Vance as a messenger on this may be an imperfect messenger, because we have, as you introduced him, as a combat correspondent, which was what his title was. But when you dig a little deeper into that, he was a public affairs specialist, someone who did not see combat, which certainly the title combat correspondent kind of gives you a different impression.
Within 24 hours of the selection of Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, as Kamala Harris's running mate, a part of his military record came quickly into question. J.D. Vance in particular seized on a statement that Governor Walz had made in support of infringing on people's Second Amendment rights by saying that weapons of war that he had carried in war should not be on the streets. But of course, Mr. Walz didn't carry weapons in war. He was deployed to Italy to provide security for some American bases as the fight was going on in Afghanistan. Then questions came up as to whether he misrepresented his rank when he retired and whether he left the National Guard knowing that his unit was about to be deployed to Iraq. All of those questions are being discussed. But what happened yesterday on CNN is noteworthy all in and of itself, because J.D. Vance, a Marine who was deployed to Iraq, has been leading the criticism of Mr. Walz. And anchor Breonna Taylor decided that she wanted to push back a little bit on the running mate of Donald Trump. Take a look.
I also think that J.D. Vance as a messenger on this may be an imperfect messenger, because we have, as you introduced him, as a combat correspondent, which was what his title was. But when you dig a little deeper into that, he was a public affairs specialist, someone who did not see combat, which certainly the title combat correspondent kind of gives you a different impression. So he may be the imperfect messenger on that.
So in other words, Breonna Taylor is saying something that even Tim Walz and Kamala Harris wouldn't venture to say, that, you know, J.D. Vance's military record is nothing to shout home about. Vance took to Elon Musk's X platform and pushed back, said, Breonna, this is disgusting, and you and your entire network should be ashamed of yourself. When I got the call to go to Iraq, I went. Tim Walz said he carried a gun in a war. Did he? No, it was a lie. And if I may add to that, this is the tombstone of Major Megan McClung at Arlington National Cemetery. She was killed in action in Iraq. As you can see, she had the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star with Operation Iraqi Freedom. She was the first woman to be a casualty of the Iraq War. She was also the first female graduate of the United States Naval Academy to ever die in combat. And she was a public affairs officer. Her job was the same job that J.D. Vance had. In fact, she died in Iraq when her vehicle, escorting Newsweek journalists in the war zone, met with a roadside bomb. The journalists were unharmed, but she died while she was protecting and escorting those journalists, the very colleagues of CNN's Breonna Taylor. This was so wrong, what CNN did, what Breonna Taylor did, but it tells you exactly where things stand now in the political discourse in America and how the media plays a role in it. And I'm going to start with Chris Stigall on this one, because I know he shares many of my sentiments about the media. But you say she didn't have to do that. Breonna Taylor could actually step back and let the politicians fight this one out. But she decided not just to take Tim Walz's side in this, because she can't. There's nothing she can say about Tim Walz. The facts are facts. But instead, she tried to disparage J.D. Vance. And that's as low as you can go, I think.
Yeah, Breonna's upset because CNN questioned if she was the best messenger to deliver their morning show and lost her job recently, I think. No one watches her. And she was summarily fired. So she's been demoted to middays delivering this pablum. Yeah, she's a loathsome creature, to be sure. But you know what this brought to mind? And you just brought up that fallen hero, Megan. And her escorting journalists around. Once upon a time, not only was what Breonna Taylor considered loathsome, what she said loathsome, do you remember Brian Williams, who once anchored the esteemed nightly news, and why he ultimately was dispatched from that broadcast? It was because he totally lied about being fired upon while covering the Iraq War, when people that were helicoptering him in and out of a war zone said none of that ever happened. He would tell this story on Letterman, and people caught him and said, "Why are you telling this story?" And he ultimately said, "Well, you know, I embellish things." And the NBC suspended him, and then he was sent back to MSNBC like on parole or something, and now has vanished from the earth. I don't even know where he went. But not long ago, the press thought it pretty remarkable to lie about being fired upon, even when you're not in the military. So imagine now how far we've fallen, that you would defend Tim Walz and disparage the legitimate service of someone if you're somebody like Breonna Keeler.
Yeah, it's a good point. And Akash, listen, I did not serve. I'm trying to stay out of this fight. I wish Breonna Keeler and other journalists would do the same. But if the Tim Walz selection was to appeal to sort of the blue collar, rural sort of voter, that's exactly what they've telegraphed. I don't know if this military record thing is going to do the trick for them.
No, I mean, I'm of the opinion Tim Walz is kind of a nothing burger in every kind of sense imaginable. He doesn't really do anything for Kamala Harris, as Chris was talking about previously. But this is pretty concerning. Stolen valor, I mean, that is horrific. I mean, we've all flown into Washington Reagan Airport, and when you look out to your left, you see the Washington Monument and all these beautiful things. But I think the real beauty of our country lies when you look out the right side of that plane over Arlington Cemetery, and there are thousands and thousands of headstones like Megan McClung's. Those are the real heroes who are the reason we have the country that we do. And so to disparage anyone's service in Iraq or Afghanistan the way that the CNN anchor did, I think it's just so beyond shameful. And it's also shameful to lie about doing anything like that. And if that is in fact what Governor Walz did, I think that's very, very concerning. And frankly, I think should be a defining aspect of his candidacy. We know that he's a far left progressive in line with the San Francisco liberals, and his track record as governor deserves to be dissected. But as far as the kind of person that he is, if this is in fact something he was dishonest about, it is something the American people deserve to know and factor into their vote.
Well said. You know, he has continued to claim that he retired as a command sergeant major when in fact he didn't officially achieve that rank, since he didn't serve out the final part of his term. That means he actually retired as a master sergeant. The Harris campaign have now updated their website to reflect that adjustment. So that's an acknowledgement that this was first misrepresented by Mr. Walz. And if I could, Elaine, I think ultimately this is a reflection of Kamala Harris. You know, when you're a candidate for president, your first major decision, and it's all your choice, is who your running mate's going to be. What does this tell us about Kamala Harris's wisdom, judgment, and ability to vet people as she's actually selecting her team?
Well, let's be clear. Kamala Harris was probably not part of any of this election. There are people behind her pulling the strings and making the decisions on who she runs with, what she says, where she says it, and how often she says it. So she's not making these decisions at all. There's no way she made any of these decisions. He doesn't bring anything to the ticket at all. And I'll further add that the last time we saw a Democratic candidate be dishonest about their military record, his name was John Kerry. And I think we know how all of that ended. The American people did not take kindly to someone lying about their military record.
Yeah, well said. And by the way, the most passionate people speaking out against John Kerry's aggrandizement of his military record were his fellow sailors in the Navy there who served with him in Vietnam. And of course, we're seeing really the same thing happen here with fellow soldiers from the Minnesota National Guard. It'll be fascinating to see this one develop, but it ain't going away. It's not going away anytime soon.